Hello?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Is this Mrs. Dorothy Letterman?
That's right, Dorothy.
Yes, it is. Who's this?
Are you the mother of David Letterman who does Late Night on NBC?
Picture this. You spend years grinding through comedy clubs, sleeping on couches, eating cheap meals, and dreaming of one night that changes everything. Then that night finally comes. You walk out under those bright studio lights, the band plays you in, and you absolutely nail it. The crowd loves you. Johnny Carson loves you. He gives you the nod, the smile, the wave over to the chair. You've made it. America knows your name now. And then, years later, without a single phone call, without one explanation, without even a formal goodbye, you're gone. The invitations stop. Your name disappears from the guest lists. People in the industry start looking the other way when they see you coming. And the most terrifying part? You never even saw it coming. This wasn't fiction. This was the reality of working in Hollywood during the reign of Johnny Carson. The Tonight Show wasn't just a television program. It was a gatekeeper, a throne room, and sometimes a guillotine. And tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the stories that never made the highlight reels. The feuds, the fallouts, the silent banishments that quietly destroyed careers and broke hearts that the cameras never caught. To truly understand what it meant to be banned from The Tonight Show, you first have to understand what The Tonight Show actually was. And I mean really was, not just as a television program, but as a cultural institution that held more power over Hollywood careers than almost any studio, any agent, or any award show could ever dream of holding. From the moment Johnny Carson took over the hosting chair in 1962, something extraordinary happened. Night after night, year after year, tens of millions of Americans tuned in not just for entertainment, but for connection. This was before the internet. Before social media. Before you could build an audience from your bedroom with a camera and a Wi-Fi connection. If you wanted the nation to know who you were, there were very few roads that led there, and the widest, smoothest, most powerful road ran straight through NBC's studio in Burbank, California, right to Johnny Carson's desk. Comedians who had been toiling in small clubs for years suddenly became household names after a single 5-minute set on Carson's stage. Actors whose careers were stalling found new life after a single warm conversation with Johnny at that famous desk. Musicians, authors, athletes, everyone understood the currency of a Carson appearance. It wasn't just exposure. It was legitimacy. It was a stamp of approval from the most trusted entertainer in America. Carson had a gift that simply cannot be manufactured or taught in any classroom. He had the rare ability to make everything look completely effortless. His timing was surgical. His wit was lightning quick but never cruel in a way that made audiences uncomfortable. He knew exactly when to lean in, when to pull back, when to let a guest shine, and when to subtly remind everyone in the room, and everyone watching at home, who was actually in charge of this particular kingdom. That last part is crucial. Because as warm and charming as Carson appeared on your television screen every night, there was an iron fist behind that easy smile. Johnny Carson ran his show the way a general runs a military operation. Everything had its place. Every guest had their role. Every moment of every broadcast was, in some essential way, under his control. And when something, or someone, threatened that control, the response was swift, quiet, and absolutely devastating. Here's the thing about Carson's unwritten rules. Nobody handed you a pamphlet when you walked through the studio doors. There was no handbook that said do not upstage the host or do not make career decisions without giving Johnny a heads up first. The rules existed entirely in the atmosphere, passed down through whispers between managers and agents and publicists who had learned the hard way what happened when those invisible lines got crossed. Some of the rules were almost logical, if you thought about them from Carson's perspective. He had spent decades building something genuinely rare and precious, a nightly ritual that millions of Americans trusted and loved. He was protective of it the way a craftsman is protective of his finest work. Surprise him on stage, and you weren't just embarrassing him. In his mind, you were disrespecting everything he had built. Mess with the rhythm of the show, and you weren't just being difficult, you were threatening something that a man had poured 30 years of his life into perfecting. Other rules were harder to understand, even in hindsight. Carson could be deeply loyal to the people he championed, but that loyalty came with an expectation of loyalty in return that bordered on the absolute. In his world, there were people who were with him and people who were not. There was no comfortable middle ground, no graceful way to be your own person while also remaining in his good graces. And if you ever made a decision, professional, personal, or otherwise, that he interpreted as a slight against him, the warmth evaporated overnight. What made it particularly brutal was the silence. Carson never called press conferences to announce his feuds. He never gave interviews where he aired his grievances. He simply withdrew. And because of who he was, because of the gravitational pull his show exerted over the entire entertainment industry, that withdrawal sent a message that every single person in Hollywood understood without a single word being spoken. If Johnny was done with you, the industry was done with you. It was that simple. It was that devastating. No story captures the complexity of Johnny Carson's world better than the story of Joan Rivers. And no fallout was more painful, more public in its eventual unraveling, or more heartbreaking in its final chapter. Joan Rivers arrived on The Tonight Show in the mid-1960s as a raw, electric, completely original voice in comedy. Female stand-up comedians were genuinely rare in that era. The industry wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for women who wanted to stand on stage and be funny on their own terms. Joan did it anyway, grinding through clubs and small gigs and endless rejection before she finally got her shot on Carson's stage. When she delivered that first set, something clicked. Carson turned to the camera with that famous grin and told America that this was someone they were going to be hearing a lot about. That one sentence was worth 1,000 bookings. That one endorsement from the most trusted man in late-night television transformed Joan Rivers from a struggling comedian into a star practically overnight. She became a Tonight Show regular. She became a writer for the program. She became Carson's permanent guest host when he took nights off, the closest thing to a presumptive heir that Johnny Carson ever acknowledged. For 2 decades, theirs was one of the most celebrated partnerships in television. And then, in 1986, it ended in a way that neither of them ever fully recovered from. Fox, then a brand new network hungry for talent and credibility, came to Joan with an extraordinary offer, her own late-night talk show. The chance to become the first woman in history to host a major late-night program. It was a genuine milestone, a career-defining opportunity that she would have been professionally reckless to simply walk away from. She thought about it carefully. She agonized over it. And ultimately, she said yes. The problem wasn't that she left. The problem was that Carson found out through the industry grapevine rather than from Joan herself. He had championed her, protected her, elevated her for 20 years, and he learned about her biggest career move from someone other than her. In Carson's world, that registered as a fundamental betrayal. Not a misunderstanding. Not poor communication. A betrayal. He hung up the phone when she tried to call. He returned none of her letters. He never spoke to her publicly, but his silence communicated everything that needed communicating to everyone who mattered in Hollywood. Joan Rivers was out. Not just from The Tonight Show, from the entire conversation. The show that had made her refuse to acknowledge she had ever existed. Clips of her appearances were buried. Her name was erased from the program's history with a thoroughness that could only have been deliberate. Joan spent years trying to reach him. She wrote letters annually, hoping for some response, some acknowledgement, some pathway back to a relationship that had meant everything to her career and, clearly, to her as a person. Nothing ever came. When Carson passed away in 2005, Joan wept, not only because the world had lost a television giant, but because she had lost her mentor without ever getting the chance to make things right between them. She once said in an interview that she would have done anything, absolutely anything, just to sit down and talk with him one more time. He never gave her that chance. Joan Rivers may be the most well-known casualty of Carson's particular brand of professional exile, but she was far from the only one who found themselves on the wrong side of that famous smile. Rich Little was one of the most talented impressionists of his generation, a performer whose ability to inhabit other voices was genuinely remarkable. He was a Tonight Show favorite for years, until his impression of Carson himself became too sharp, too frequent, too reminiscent of a student openly mocking the teacher. The official explanation offered at the time was that his material had simply grown stale. Those who were close to the situation understood the real story. Carson had stopped finding it funny. And when Carson stopped finding something funny, the booking calls stopped following shortly after. Dana Carvey ran into similar territory during a press tour for Wayne's World. His Carson impression was spot on, arguably one of the best ever captured on camera. The problem was that Carson didn't see it as flattery. He saw it as appropriation, as someone taking something that belonged to him and turning it into a punchline. Carvey was quietly blacklisted, the door closing behind him without ceremony or explanation. Howie Mandel's sin was somewhat different and, in some ways, more sympathetic. Early in his career, still figuring out how to be memorable on a national stage, he brought a large uncleared prop onto the Tonight Show set, a giant stuffed animal that nobody in production had approved. It was intended as comedy. It played as chaos. Carson hated chaos above almost everything else, and he hated surprises on his stage above almost everything else. Mandel was never invited back. No confrontation, no explanation. Just the absence of an invitation that never arrived. There was also the matter of Wayne Newton, whose feud with Carson was unusual in that it actually became semi-public. When Newton outbid Carson for partial ownership of a Las Vegas hotel in the early 1980s, Carson responded not with a private conversation but with his microphone, weaving digs about Newton into his monologues night after night. When Newton eventually confronted him directly backstage at NBC, Carson backed down from the jokes. But the friendship was finished, and Newton's access to The Tonight Show ended with it. Each of these stories follows a different path to the same destination. Some crossed Carson on stage. Some crossed him in business. Some crossed him simply by being themselves in ways that made him uncomfortable. But the outcome was always the same: quiet, permanent, industry-wide exile. Understanding why Carson operated this way requires understanding who Carson actually was when the cameras stopped rolling. And the picture that emerges from those who knew him best is genuinely complex. Johnny Carson grew up in Nebraska, a self-made entertainer who had clawed his way from small-town magic shows to Navy service to local radio gigs to the most powerful desk in American television. Every step of that journey was earned through talent, discipline, and an almost obsessive need to control his environment and his